Welcome back. We are still in the brain rabbit hole. This episode gets into scans, ADHD, trauma, and why he hates the broken brain idea. And honestly, the whole thing gets pretty spicy fast. The wildest part is how he treats thoughts like a trainable habit. That is either genius or dangerously optimistic. Probably both, which is why it works as podcast fuel. He starts with ADHD like it is a glasses problem, not a character flaw. And that is a way more humane way to say it. I get why people react to that because it instantly removes shame. Right, it is like your brain is not evil, it is just not focusing. But then he takes it further and says the scan can show it deactivating. That is the part that feels like sci-fi until you hear the examples. Like, congratulations, your frontal lobe is having a very lazy afternoon. Exactly, and somehow that becomes a medical explanation instead of a moral judgment. I think that matters because shame makes people worse at everything. What I kept thinking was, okay, if medication helps you focus, why do people fight it so much? Because the word medication still makes people hear dependence instead of support. And because everyone thinks their personal discipline should be enough, which is a cute idea until your brain is literally underpowered. Then he jumps into those negative thoughts, the ants thing. Automatic negative thoughts sounds like a metal band. Honestly, it does, and a very annoying one. But the method is interesting, because he is not saying pretend everything is great. He is basically saying interrogate the thought until it loses power. Which sounds easy until your brain is in full courtroom drama mode. Bro, every anxious person already has a 10-part series running in their head. Still, I like the accuracy part more than the positivity part. Because false positivity is just bad branding for denial. Eat the cheesecake, manifest the blood sugar spike, call it wellness. That was savage, but yes, that is exactly the trap. Then the stress conversation gets heavier because he ties it to childhood fighting and cortisol. That part lands hard because chronic stress does not feel dramatic while it is happening. It just becomes the water you are swimming in. And then later you call it your personality, which is brutal. The trauma stuff is where he really leans into biology, though. The diamond pattern explanation was fascinating because he is describing something visible. So trauma is not just a story, it is a brain state. And EMDR comes up as this weirdly practical tool for changing that state. I always wonder how much people trust a therapy that looks so unusual. The eye movement part does sound like someone made it up in a dream. But if it helps somebody stop reliving the thing, who cares how strange it looks? That is the real point, because relief is the metric, not elegance. I also like the idea of brain reserve because that makes trauma feel less random. It says the same blast can hit two people differently depending on what came before. Which is a much better explanation than just saying one person is weak. Right, it replaces shame with context. And then he turns around and starts talking about childhood brain training like it is normal. Teach preschoolers to kill the ants, bro, what a sentence. It sounds ridiculous until you realize adults never learned it either. That is probably the bigger tragedy, honestly. Because if people learned thought discipline early, a lot of later damage might shrink. Maybe, but humans are also extremely committed to their worst habits. True, we will defend misery like it pays rent. The media piece is another sharp turn because he sees the news as brain pollution. He basically says the news is optimized for panic and clicks. And honestly, that is hard to argue with. Though I do think he goes hard on the 24-hour doom diet. But the point stands that repeated input shapes mood. If you feed your brain threat all day, it will start behaving like the world is threat. That connects so neatly to his anxiety argument. He does not want zero anxiety, he wants useful anxiety. That is such a sane take that it feels radical. Then he goes into vitamin D and infection, which is where the episode gets very grounded. Especially with darker skin and less sunlight, that part hits reality fast. It reframes mood as something physical enough to check, not just interpret. And COVID becomes another example of inflammation messing with emotion and cognition. Emotional brain on fire is a terrifying phrase, but it sounds accurate. It is, and it explains why people got weird after infections instead of just sad. Then he lands on depression, and that part felt almost stubborn in a good way. He keeps saying, evaluate first, do not slap on a label and walk away. That is such a clean challenge to psychiatry as practiced. Also a little provocative, because medication still saves people. Yeah, and he does admit that, which keeps him from sounding like a crank. But his broader point is that treatment should start with why, not just what. That feels like the most useful sentence in the whole episode. Because if the brain is the organ, then the goal is optimization, not identity damage. And that one line changes everything about how you talk to people. It also sounds way better than telling somebody their brain is broken. Broken is such a lazy word for a complicated organ. Anyway, that is where this episode really hits. Brain scans, trauma, habits, and responsibility. We will keep going because the next section gets even more personal. And probably even more controversial, which is always fun. All right, we will pick this up in the next one. In episode 3, we get into diet, hormones, and the bigger system behind brain health. Welcome back, because this one gets into brain scans, trauma, and why labels can get messy. It is part science, part therapy, and part a giant argument about how we talk to people. And the wild part is how much of it starts with a simple scan. Like one picture and suddenly the whole conversation changes. That is either incredibly powerful or a little terrifying. The core idea is that mental health is brain health, not just a personality problem. That sounds helpful until people start using scans like a verdict. Yeah, because humans definitely do not misuse any new tool ever. But I get why the scan matters emotionally to people. If someone thinks they are lazy or broken, a scan can feel like relief. That woman with adult ADD is the clearest example. She basically heard, "Oh, I am not defective, I need glasses for the brain." And that is such a better frame than shame. But I also keep thinking, what happens when the frame becomes too fixed? Because then every bad day turns into a diagnosis story. Right, and he is trying to avoid that by calling it difference, not defect. Which is a nice line until someone says, "Cool, but I still cannot focus." Exactly, because philosophy does not fill out your planner. The medication point is interesting too, because he describes it like glasses. That is a much less loaded way to explain help. But it also makes it sound a little too neat. Like one pill equals one personality upgrade. Human brains have never been known for being neat. The more compelling part to me is the negative thought loop stuff. The whole kill the ants thing is basically about interrupting automatic negativity, which is such an aggressive metaphor for journaling. But somehow it works, because your brain really does act like a chaotic little machine. He is basically saying thoughts are chemistry, and repeated thoughts become wiring. And I think that is where people get defensive, because it feels like blame. Like, are you saying my depression is my fault because I thought badly enough? He is trying not to say that, but I can see how people hear it that way. The more useful read is that habits can reshape the mind in both directions. And the Byron Katie-style questioning gives it a structure. Is it true? Is it absolutely true? How do I act? What happens next? That is strong. It is basically a courtroom for your own thoughts. Your brain enters and usually starts lying immediately. Immediately with confidence too, which is the annoying part. What I also liked was the distinction between positive thinking and accurate thinking. Because just be positive is usually lazy advice. Also, cheesecake optimism is not a health strategy. That line should be on a mug somewhere. The stress section gets darker though, because now it is childhood stress and cortisol. And he is making the case that home conflict can literally affect memory centers. That part feels very real, honestly. If your emotional brain is busy surviving, school is not the priority. Which makes a lot of, "Why were you not more focused?" conversations sound ridiculous. Yeah, like the child was supposed to defeat the family atmosphere by discipline. Trauma, though, is where the scan stuff gets really intense. He says it can show up as that diamond pattern, especially in the emotional brain. And then EMDR comes in like, wait, we can actually shift this? That is the kind of thing people do not expect from psychology. He treats it like a biological intervention with psychological tools. Do you buy the reserve idea, though? The idea that the same trauma hits different people differently because of what they brought into it? I do, but I also hate how easy it is to turn that into a hierarchy of suffering. Right, because it is not saying one person had it worse. It is saying resilience is built before the crisis. And then the brain reserve becomes almost like emotional savings. Emotional savings is such a funny phrase, but it is kind of accurate. That is why the early childhood piece hits hard, because you are building the bank account before life starts charging interest. That was annoyingly good, by the way. I know I scared myself a little. The children's course part is also telling, because he wants this stuff taught early. Little kids learning not to believe every stupid thought they have is actually brilliant. Children would be better off than half of adults if that was normal. And that links back to his obsession with responsibility without shame, which is tricky because some people hear responsibility and immediately hear blame. He seems to be aiming for agency, not punishment. Then he swings into the darker edge of all this with criminal brains. That 15-year-old case is brutal. A shriveled brain at 15 is just heartbreaking and terrifying. And it forces the question of what happened before the violence even existed. But I always get nervous when brain science gets too close to moral judgment. Same, because low frontal function is not the same thing as no accountability. Also, society loves the fantasy of a clean answer to evil. And brains refuse to cooperate with that fantasy, which is rude of them. The presidential candidate argument is where it gets really dangerous politically. I understand the impulse because leadership does require judgment and impulse control. But once you normalize scanning for power, everybody starts asking who gets excluded next. That is the slippery slope from health screening into prejudice. Imagine getting rejected from a marketing job because your cerebellum looked moody. That would be an absurd dystopia, and yet somehow very on-brand for us. I did like the family rule, though, because it is so him. If you date my child, your brain gets scanned as wild behavior. That is not a boundary, that is a brand. But he is consistent, and consistency is kind of the whole argument here. He keeps coming back to one-page miracle thinking and clear goals. Basically, know what you want, or your brain fills the void with junk. Which is tragically relatable. That also explains why he hates the news as a daily input. Because repeated fear is sticky, and outrage is engineered to stick. News first thing as a morning is basically opening a casino in your mind. That is one of the better insults to the news I have heard. But the true crime habit is hilarious in this context, because that is also negativity entertainment. He is basically saying, stop feeding your brain serial killers before bedtime. Which is probably good advice, even if people do not want to hear it. The vitamin D section surprised me less, because that one has a real-world social angle. Darker skin, low sunlight, and then mood problems can look psychological when they are partly biological. That is exactly why his brain health framing matters. Because if you only look at symptoms, you miss the cause. And then COVID comes in and makes the whole thing more obvious. Hot emotional brain, lower cortex activity, more impulsivity, more sadness, more chaos. That is not a small effect, that is a system-wide problem. The depression part lands hardest because he keeps saying, evaluate first. Chest pain gets a workup, so depression should get a workup too. Thyroid, anemia, B12, all that before you just hand over a label. Which is honestly humane, and also a little rebellious against the whole system. And that rebellion is the thread. Stop calling people broken and start asking why. Which is a far better podcast question than what diagnosis do you have? Way better and way harder to answer cleanly. All right, we have gone through scans, trauma, thoughts, and the label fight. The big tension is still there. This can empower people or box them in. That is exactly why the next section matters, because the body starts entering the conversation. In episode 3, we get into diet, hormones, and the bigger system behind brain health. Welcome back. This episode is all about scans, trauma, and why labels can help or trap people. And the whole fight is whether you call somebody broken or just under-supported. Because that one word changes everything, honestly. Wait, the ADD example is still wild to me because the brain literally shuts down under focus. That is such a rude thing for a brain to do mid-conversation. Like, sorry, boss, I am unavailable for concentration. But it also explains why medication can feel like glasses instead of a crutch. That metaphor is powerful because nobody feels morally superior for needing glasses. Right, but people still panic when brain treatment sounds chemical. And that panic is usually about stigma, not science. The negative thought exercise was interesting too, because it sounds simple until you actually try it. Writing down 100 awful thoughts sounds like emotional cardio. And 100 is such an insulting number that your ego starts sweating. But the point is repetition, not drama. Your brain keeps rehearsing whatever you keep feeding it. Still, I do wonder if people can use that advice to gaslight themselves. Like, what if somebody has a real problem and keeps trying to positive think their way out of it? That is where accurate thinking matters more than happy thinking. which is a very unsexy slogan, but probably a better one. Accuracy with a positive spin is actually a strong line. And it makes sense with anxiety too, because the goal is not zero fear. If you have some anxiety, you might actually do the right thing. Zero anxiety is how people end up climbing something stupid or buying something worse, or making a podcast decision without reviewing the consequences. Exactly, just enough fear to keep the microphone attached. The stress conversation gets darker because chronic stress can really shape development. The hippocampus shrinking thing is brutal, especially when childhood is loud at home. That is where the conversation stops being abstract. It starts looking like a kid trying to learn inside a storm. And trauma is not just one massive event either, which I think people forget. It can be anything that crushes safety, physically or emotionally. Even a humiliation, even public failure, even a moment that rewires your body. The idea that trauma shows up in patterns on a scan is fascinating and slightly unsettling. It is unsettling because it makes invisible pain feel measurable. But measurable pain is sometimes the only thing the system respects. The EMDR part was the biggest surprise for me because it sounds almost too simple. Eye movements helping trauma? Sounds like one of those things people dismiss too fast. But if it reduces activation, then who cares how weird it looks? Medical science is full of things that sound fake until they work. The brain reserve idea might be the most useful part of the whole thing, because two people can take the same hit and walk away with totally different outcomes. So the question becomes, what did you bring into the trauma before the trauma even happened? Exactly. And that is where childhood nutrition, stress, neglect, and pregnancy all matter. That is a lot to carry before life has even started to get dramatic. Human beings are really overworked from day one. I also like the ant metaphor, because negative thoughts sound silly until you live with them. And then your brain becomes a tiny pest management company. That is actually the best branding for therapy I have heard. But seriously, the point is you do not have to believe every thought. That line alone could save people from half their worst impulses, especially when the thought is loud, repetitive, and dressed up as truth. The family brain scan rule is where it gets ethically messy, though. Like on one hand, I get wanting to know who your child is dating. On the other hand, that is an insane sentence to say out loud. Because once you normalize scanning, you open the door to prejudice. That was the strongest devil's advocate argument in the whole episode. If politicians get scanned, then why not teachers, bankers, or restaurant managers? Suddenly it becomes a caste system with brain images. And that is not a small fear, that is a real slope. But then the counterpoint is also real. If you hold power, why should nobody evaluate your brain? Especially if the decisions affect millions of people. I think the disagreement is less about scans and more about what society does with them. Exactly. Because tools become dangerous when institutions are lazy or cruel. Which is a very polite way of saying humans will absolutely misuse the technology. For sure, we would turn neuroscience into a LinkedIn flex in 6 weeks. The depression discussion brought it back to humility, though. Because chest pain, depression, thyroid, anemia, B12, all of that means you start with why. Not with a label, not with a forever identity. That part feels genuinely humane. And I liked the line about people being awesome and needing more access to their brain. That is a much better emotional doorway than telling someone they are a diagnosis. Nobody wakes up inspired to be optimized, but they do like being respected. Respect gets people in the room. Truth keeps them there. The news piece also hit harder than I expected because it is basically brain junk food. If you start your day with panic, your afternoon is going to be annoying. That should be embroidered on every remote control. Still, I do not think the answer is ignorance. It is dosage, like most things in this conversation. Enough information to stay informed, not enough to become a hostage. The vitamin D and immunity part is where this becomes really global. Darker skin, less sunlight, new country, no supplementation, and suddenly mental health changes. That is not a moral failing, that is biology meeting geography. And that matters because a brain-first model changes treatment. It could mean less medication, or a smaller dose, or a different starting point. But it should also make us careful not to oversimplify every struggle into one deficiency. Right, because the whole episode keeps saying systems, not slogans. All right, we have gone through scans, trauma, thoughts, and the label fight. The big tension is still there. This can empower people or box them in. That is exactly why the next section matters, because the body starts entering the conversation. In episode 3, we get into diet, hormones, and the bigger system behind brain health.